The city never sleeps, but for some, it never wakes up either. The year was 1911, and New York City was a boiling pot of ambition and desperation. Skyscrapers stretched toward the heavens, each brick laid with the promise of wealth. Yet the streets below told a different story. A story of thousands of nameless workers drowning in poverty, working endless hours for meager wages. Among those who thrived at the top of this system was a man whose name was spoken in both admiration and fear. A man whose factories produced garments at an unmatched pace, supplying the entire nation with the latest in fashion. His empire was built on the backs of the poor, and he knew it. In his office, high above the bustling streets, he sipped from a crystal glass, his fingers tracing the edges of golden coins stacked neatly on his desk. He loved the sound of money, the rustle of dollar bills, the clink of coins, the smooth flow of ink on a contract that would squeeze just a little more out of those who had nothing. Efficiency, gentlemen, he declared to his board. That is the key to wealth, not charity, not pity, efficiency. Down below, the factory workers toiled under the deafening hum of sewing machines. Hundreds of hands stitched and cut, hour after hour, in a windowless room that reeked of sweat and fatigue. The air was thick with cotton dust, clinging to their skin, filling their lungs. The young girls, some no older than 15, worked with mechanical precision, their fingers moving like gears in a machine that never stopped. They didn't dare complain. Complaining meant no job. No job meant no food. And he knew that too. To him, their suffering was just another expense he didn't have to pay. But as he laughed in his ivory tower, toasting to another year of record profits, something was happening down below. A small spark, barely noticeable at first, was about to set everything ablaze. And for the first time in his life, he would see what happens when the poor have no escape. The factory hummed with life, but it was a life without freedom. Inside the towering Triangle Waste Company building, the workers were no more than pieces in a massive, unyielding machine. The sewing needles stabbed through fabric in rapid succession, guided by hands that trembled from exhaustion. The air was heavy with lint, thick enough to choke on, yet no one dared to stop. Stopping meant the overseer's sharp gaze, and worse, dock in pay. But the worst part wasn't the work itself. It was the doors. Every morning, hundreds of girls streamed into the factory, their laughter faint at first, but soon drowned out by the sounds of industry. The doors shut behind them with an eerie finality, their only exit routes locked from the outside. The rich man's rules were simple. No leaving until the day's work was done. No breaks without permission. No escape. To the workers, it was cruel. To the factory owners, it was policy. Theft prevention, the foreman would say, their voices dripping with indifference. Keeps the girls from sneaking out with fabric. Fabric. That was what mattered, not the people who toiled over it. On the upper floors, an argument was unfolding between two supervisors. "This is madness," one of them whispered harshly. "The fire inspectors warned us." "These conditions? And what? We're going to lose time and money over what-ifs?" "No one's dying in here," the other scoffed, lighting a cigar. "The only fire we need to worry about is making sure production doesn't slow down." In the factory below, the girls heard none of this. They worked as they always did, heads down, fingers sore, their backs aching against the stiff wooden stools. But there was a tension in the air, a feeling that something wasn't right, a feeling that had been creeping into their bones for weeks. A young girl named Anna wiped her brow, smudging sweat and cotton dust across her forehead. She glanced at the door leading to the stairwell. It was locked. She already knew it would be, but she checked anyway. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to look today. Maybe it was the way the air had grown unusually dry. Maybe it was the flickering gaslights casting strange shadows across the walls, or maybe, just maybe, it was the unshakable feeling that the rich man's greed had finally set a trap too tight to escape. And that soon, very soon, they would all realize what it meant to be locked inside. For all the wealth built inside its walls, the factory was a death trap waiting to be sprung. On that fateful afternoon, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long streaks of golden light through the high, dirt-streaked windows. The workday was winding down, but the pace never slowed. Orders had to be filled. Production had to meet quotas. There was no such thing as done in the Triangle Waste Company. Anna, like the others, kept her head down, her fingers moving with the same mechanical precision as the thousands of stitches she had sewn before. But something felt off. Her eyes flicked up toward the other side of the room. A cutter, his face slick with sweat, was working faster than usual. The pile of discarded fabric scraps at his feet had grown taller, dry bits of cotton clinging to the floor like autumn leaves. The gaslights overhead flickered as a small ember, barely noticeable, leapt from the end of a worker's cigarette and disappeared into the pile. No one saw it at first, not until the fabric glowed with the first hungry flickers of orange. A single scream shattered the rhythm of the sewing machines, and then chaos. The fire moved unnaturally fast, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The dry fabric scraps, the endless wooden tables, the oil-slicked floors, it all became an inferno in seconds. The flames licked at the walls, devouring everything in their path. Smoke curled upward thick and black, swallowing the high ceilings. Anna jumped from her seat, knocking over her stool. She wasn't the only one. All around her, girls pushed back from their stations, eyes wide with panic. "Fire!" someone shrieked. The word echoed through the factory like a gunshot, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Chairs crashed, fabric was trampled underfoot, bodies shoved against one another in blind terror. Anna turned to the nearest exit, the stairwell. It was their only way out. She ran for the door, her heart slamming against her ribs. She reached it first, hands fumbling for the knob. It didn't budge. She yanked harder. It was locked. A sob caught in her throat. She spun around, eyes darting to the only other escape, the windows. Some of the girls had the same idea. A few had already climbed onto the ledges, their silhouettes illuminated against the blaze. The factory was 9 stories high. There was nowhere to go. Anna looked up, searching for someone, anyone who could save them. Above the inferno, high in his office, the rich man sat in his leather chair, pouring himself another drink. He hadn't even noticed the smoke yet. And by the time he did, it would be too late. The flames roared like a beast, set free, devouring everything in sight. Smoke coiled through the air, thick and suffocating, burning throats and stealing breath before screams could even escape. The factory had become a furnace, a tomb of fire and steel. Anna pounded against the locked door with every ounce of strength she had. Others joined her, their fists bruising against the unyielding wood. Someone, maybe Maria, maybe Esther, let out a raw, desperate cry. "The doors! They're locked! We can't get out!" A terrifying realization settled over them. The doors had been locked all along, not just today, but every day before it. This wasn't an accident. This was a cage built by the rich man himself. On the factory floor, Workers scattered in all directions, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Some sprinted to the elevators, hammering on the metal doors, but the operators had long since abandoned their posts. Others scrambled toward the fire escape, a flimsy, rusted staircase clinging to the outside of the building. Anna saw a group force their way onto it, 6, 7, 8 of them, maybe more. The iron groaned beneath their weight. She wanted to believe it would hold. She wanted to believe something in this place had been built to protect them. Then, with a sound like thunder, the fire escape wrenched away from the brick wall. Anna watched in horror as the bodies tumbled, their screams swallowed by the city below. A hand gripped her arm. It was Esther. Her face was streaked with soot, her brown eyes wild with terror. "We have to get to the windows," she gasped. Anna hesitated. Jump from this height? It was insanity. But as she turned back, she saw the fire surging closer, creeping toward them like a living thing. The flames didn't hesitate. They didn't wait. They didn't give second chances. Her legs moved before her mind could protest. Together, she and Esther stumbled toward the row of windows. All around them, girls were already climbing onto the ledges, staring down at the pavement far below. Anna's breath came in ragged gasps. The street below was crowded. A sea of horrified faces stared up at them. Shopkeepers, pedestrians, people who had simply been walking by, only to witness something unspeakable. A man in the crowd screamed up at them, "Jump! Jump before the fire gets you!" Anna's stomach twisted. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even encouragement. It was a fact. Either the flames would take them, or the fall would. Beside her, Esther gripped the window frame, her entire body trembling. "Anna," she whispered, I can't." A blood-curdling scream cut through the roar of the fire. Anna turned just in time to see the ceiling beams collapse, crashing down on the workers still trapped inside. The flames surged higher, swallowing them whole. There was no time left. Anna turned to Esther, her heart hammering. "We have to go, now!" Esther stared at her for one long second, her lips trembling. Then, together, they stepped onto the edge. The fire howled behind them. The sky stretched endlessly before them and below. The rich man was finally looking. He stood on the street, safe in his expensive suit, watching as his workers, his profits, his efficiency, plunged from the burning factory he had locked them inside. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. But it wasn't him who was falling. The world blurred as Anna stepped off the ledge. The air howled past her ears, her stomach twisted in free fall, and for a brief, terrifying moment there was nothing. No sound, no pain, just the weightlessness of a life slipping through fate's fingers. Then, impact. Her body slammed against something hard, something that buckled beneath her, absorbing just enough of the fall to let her breathe, let her open her eyes, let her realize she was still alive. She had landed on a heap of fallen bodies. Anna's breath came in ragged gasps as she forced herself to move. Her limbs screamed in protest, but they still worked. Esther. Where was Esther? She twisted her head and saw her friend sprawled beside her, her face streaked with soot, her dress torn, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Alive, but barely. The screams still filled the air. The fire hadn't stopped. The factory was still burning, the flames licking at the sky, the windows still filled with desperate figures. More jumped, some landing with sickening thuds, others vanishing into the inferno behind them. The crowd on the street had grown horrified spectators watching helplessly as the tragedy unfolded. And in the midst of them, Untouched by the chaos stood the rich man. His suit was immaculate, his shoes polished, his face was ghostly pale. He had built this empire brick by brick, dollar by dollar, cutting corners wherever he could. He had locked those doors with his own rules. He had counted his profits while the workers he exploited stitched together his fortune. And now they were dead. All around him people shouted. The police struggled to contain the crowd. Angry voices swelled into a roar. Why were the doors locked? These people were trapped. You killed them. But the rich man said nothing. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, because he knew the truth. He hadn't just lost a factory today. He had lost everything. The fire had reduced more than fabric to ashes. It had burned his name into history, not as a titan of industry, but as a symbol of greed, of cruelty, of a system that had valued profit over human lives. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than any fortune he had ever held. And for the first time, he felt something he had never felt before. Fear, because wealth could buy power. It could buy silence. It could buy security. But it couldn't buy back the dead. And it couldn't erase the fire in the eyes of the people who had seen what he had done. The fire burned for hours, long after the last screams had faded. By the time the flames finally surrendered, the factory was nothing more than a charred skeleton of brick and steel, its windows shattered, its floors collapsed, its secrets turned to soot. The bodies, what was left of them, were carried out one by one, each a silent testimony to the cost of greed. The city stood still. The newspapers called it a tragedy. The workers called it murder. The people called it justice waiting to happen. And the rich man? He called his lawyers. The trial of the shirtwaist kings. Weeks later, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with anger, sorrow, and the unspoken demand for justice. The rich man and his partner sat in the defendants' chairs, their fine suits a sharp contrast to the weeping families seated behind them. They were charged with manslaughter. The prosecution painted a brutal picture: locked doors, broken fire escapes, ignored warnings. A factory turned into a prison turned into a furnace. Anna sat in the gallery, her body still aching from the fall. Esther was beside her, her arm wrapped in bandages. They had survived, but survival didn't feel like victory. Not yet. Not until the rich man was forced to face what he had done. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom held its breath. Then the verdict, not guilty. Gasps, shouts, cries of outrage. The rich man exhaled slowly, adjusting his cuffs, as if he had always known this would be the outcome. He had money, connections, power. He had won, or so he thought, because something had changed. The fire had been more than a disaster. It had been a reckoning. The people were angry. The workers were rising. The rich man had walked free, but he had awakened something that could not be contained. Across the city, across the country, voices began to rise. No more locked doors. No more stolen lives. No more factories built on the bones of the poor.